Welcome back to the Futurists. This week, I had the opportunity, actually last week, I had the opportunity to catch up with Ross Dawson in Sydney for a very pleasant meal with our kids. And we thought we should catch up for another chat. And you guys seem to like this sort of format that Robin and I do, which is just, less of an interview and more just a discussion between two futurists. So Ross and I have been friends for a long time, and thought this would be a great way to finish out the week. Glad you guys could join us. Ross Dawson, welcome back to the Futurists.
Awesome to be here.
How is the weather in Sydney today, in Bondi?
It's very pleasant. It's winter here, but it's still plenty of people on the beach. Well, not as many as in summer, but the water is still not too cold, and it's pleasant days.
And you went for a swim today? Because that's your
Not yet.
normal routine,
I
right?
will.
Not yet? Oh, good, good. Well, that's great. That's the benefit of living on, Bondi Beach. It's certainly one of the most famous beaches in Australia.
Yeah, well, it's one of the most famous in the world, and I think one of the great, wonderful things about it is global city. We've got a beach, and the temperatures mean that we can swim all year round. Unlike, for example, San Francisco,
Or New
or
York.
or any number of other cities around the world where they do have
Yeah.
beaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, it's getting easier to swim in colder places because the weather's heating up. We have seen flash flooding and tornadoes hitting the east coast of the US. The west coast, we have seen a climbing death toll from heat wave. This week, about 60 million Americans have been exposed to significant heat wave. It wasn't that long ago we had Kim Stanley Robinson on the show, and of course, he starts off his Ministry for the Future book with a scenario of, the wet dew point in India being excessive and killing millions of people. And that sort of scenario doesn't seem so unusual right now. I guess the interesting element of this is, as evidence of the whole climate debacle and so forth, heat is going to be one of those things where it is going to affect broad swathes of the population globally. How do we deal with this transition to a hotter world? Is it geoengineering? Is it like Dubai and Qatar is doing in terms of, what do you think of our adaptability to these changing weather conditions?
Well, it is pretty extreme. So if you look at the trend line of global temperature, there's a pretty steep upward curve, but 2023 was even above that curve to be
Mm.
by significantly the hottest year on record, and every month since then has been the hottest month on record. So there's this talk about limiting temperature increase to 1.5 centigrade by 2050. Well, I think we're already there. We are actually at
Yeah.
1.5 at the moment, and it's not look like it's not going back. So one point is that that's an average. So, in
Yes.
fact, what this means is that, there are, in fact, vast climate variations. As climate changes, we, in fact, get more climate variations, climate extremes, as
Volatility,
you
right? Yeah,
mentioned.
yeah.
And in fact, that 1.5 degrees in some parts of the world will be and already is a lot higher, whereas other parts of the world may, in fact, become a lot cooler as we start to see ocean currents shifting. So, this means that there are massive shifts, and it's partly of populations. So we know that there are some areas which are going to be flooded, or increasingly tenuous in terms of holding back the oceans. So these are people who are going to move. The extreme weather, which includes impact on agriculture, will mean that people will again have to move. So we're going to see massive migration, and that is the single biggest thing. We can
Oh, yeah.
in a developed country
Mass
city we can.
migration is going to be
Yeah.
like, it's like nothing we have ever dealt with. Even you can't even use the analogy necessarily of like wartime, because we're talking about potential billions of people here in terms of the upper estimates of eco refugees.
Yeah, well, there's currently 30 million refugees, people who've crossed boundaries because of war or climate or other catastrophes. And so, yes, we're certainly looking very likely to be in the hundreds of millions, which requires different policies. And this does actually reflect on the dynamics in Europe at the moment. And as this is what Peter Schwartz has called these inevitable surprises,
Mm,
where the reality of shrinking populations in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, and populous countries around them who are not as affluent, where inevitably we start to get migration, whether it's legal or not, into from North Africa and the Middle East into Europe, which does create cultural tensions, as which are playing out pretty evidently at the moment. And so when we start to amplify that by greater need for demographic shifts or migration shifts, so there's a few pieces. One is, all right, if let's say you're living in a developed country and it gets super hot, how ways we can maintain that, and that requires, amongst other things, lots of electricity for air conditioning.
yeah,
When sometimes there's
we're
not
gonna
enough
we're gonna get into
electricity.
that. We're gonna get into
So,
that.
like Texas, for example,
Yeah,
gets a bit hot sometimes, and sometimes the electricity goes down. So that's not
yeah.
very helpful. So there's a whole array of stuff, and it's kind of like say we need to be more adaptable than we've ever been. So I just
Yeah.
interviewed on my podcast Amplifying Cognition Daniel Erasmus, who's created Climate GPT, which is essentially using AI to be able to give us some guidance around some of the ways we can mitigate or move around or respond to. But I mean, we've basically got to be in a pretty responsive frame of mind to deal with the extent of change which we're going to face.
So, just looking at the Lancet research on this, which you say, why is a medical journal dealing with global warming? Well, because of the impact to public health. So, Lancet did a study last year. They expect global heat deaths are projected to increase by 370% if action is not taken to limit the effects of global warming to 2 degrees, right? So, they're already pushing that up from 1.5 to 2 degrees now. And it's expected without drastic action, an additional 525 million people are expected to experience food insecurity. That is going to be a key driver, as you say, of the eco-refugee movement, but also as a result, heat related deaths. So, the estimates for eco refugees range from anywhere from 300 million to 2 billion today. It certainly looks like we're going to be on the larger end of that scale, and we really don't have any global systems in place to cater. I mean, let's look at what happened with Syria and things like that. It's fairly small numbers comparative to what we're talking about here. So people talk about strengthening their border and things like that. If you've got, 1.5 billion people moving around the planet, or let's say 1 billion people, there's no way you can secure your borders against that number of that depth and width of people movement. It just gets beyond, um, our ability to secure against that. So ultimately, we have to fix the problem, but it's not, you know, again, you've got to stop the temperature from going up, as well as dealing with food scarcity at the source where those people are affected and so forth. And it's not the political will, to get there right now. So I guess, you know, thinking from a foresight perspective, what's it going to take for that to shift, that mentality to shift, that instead of us looking at 1 billion eco refugees as just a problem that we've got to guard against, that it is sort of a systemic breakdown, and the species requires us to intervene. I guess that's the question, right?
Well, going back to as you mentioned, I mean, for a long time, I've said I don't I see that we do need to be dealing with the issue of geoengineering because it was apparent a decade or two ago that we weren't going to reduce carbon emissions
Yeah.
to the degree necessary. There's you could even with the best will and the most optimistic outlook, there's no way in which we're going to see those see that happen. So it's been long. I've long said that we do have to look into geoengineering, and I acknowledge the pushback against that in terms of the risks of the essentially unintended consequences. We don't know what's going to happen with any number of the different types of geoengineering approaches we will take, but it's if we look at the risk of not taking any action, that is already
Yeah,
so
yeah,
severe that we do need to look at that. But I presume you've read Termination Shock by Neil
yes,
Stephenson, which
yeah,
really
yeah.
which really nicely addresses many of these issues in terms of the relative geopolitical implications and the reality which is laid out in that book, that is in fact an individual billionaire who undertakes this because no nation is, has the political will, or and there is no way we will get concerted global action around this. So whether or not it actually pans out that way, we do get non-governmental uh, you know initiatives to be able to undertake geoengineering, approved or not,
Mm.
is certainly an interesting question.
Yeah, there was a bit of that on extrapolations as well in terms of playing with that, and it had, in the Apple TV series, had some good effects versus poor effects. But we can do what we can do is we can make our infrastructure hardier to
Yes.
bigger temperatures. We've seen, for example, the work that the Qataris did for the World Cup with outdoor air conditioning and things, just essentially evaporative cooling, spraying fine mist everywhere and things like that. But if you think about where the Middle East is going to be in a few years' time, record temperatures of 55 to 60 degrees Celsius, you can't live in that heat very long. If you've spent any extended period, in the Middle East during the summer, and I lived in Dubai, during the years like 2005 to 2009, and we had our highest temperature was like 52 degrees Celsius. And you think, well, that doesn't, 127 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever. You look at that and you say, well, yeah, sure, it's hot, but it's survivable. But there's things you don't sort of really anticipate living in that sort of heat. For example, you have to drink a lot more water, even if you're going to be outside just for 5 minutes. It's an intense heat. The cars that you have, if you're driving around in public transport or in a vehicle, I mean, inside our vehicle, the temperature was as high as 70 degrees Celsius, because it's like an oven baking in the sun. And so you'd have to open all the doors and turn the air conditioning on full just to get it down to 50 degrees so you could get in the car. It was so hot one time, I remember that my son, who's now 21, so this is how far back this was, but he was on a booster seat and the booster seat melted. That's how hot it was in the car. And we're talking about another 10 degrees Celsius hotter than that. So I don't think we fully grasp how difficult it's going to be, to live in these environments, with this sort of high heat. And it's not just the living and being able to survive hotter temperatures, but of course it's the fact that so many of our crops are fairly sensitive and sensitive enough to temperature that they're going to be impacted. So, we I think you and I've talked about this before, but the Bordeaux region in France, we expect by the mid 2030s that most of the crops there would fail because of their sensitivity to temperature. Now, you could move wine growing regions to places like, Dover and Cork or Scotland, where it's been more temperate, where the soil conditions are similar to that of France, and where the warmer temperatures in those typically cooler climates is now going to support wineries. But that's not necessarily, that's a really capitalist commercial view of, well, we'll just move the wine industries, rather than saying the fact that you have to move an entire industry because of, a farming industry because you can't any longer grow crops there. That's indicative of some of the add-on problems that we're going to have from these rising temperatures. That doesn't even include like the extreme weather situations like Hurricane Beryl that we had this week in the States and so forth, right? So food scarcity becomes a big issue in this.
Yes. And which is the ability to move it, which I think goes to a bigger point. Again, for the futurist perspective, I'd say one of the biggest uncertainties in the coming decades is not so much the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, but energy innovation.
Mm.
And so, we've got potentially nuclear fission, which we could, this talk of energy too cheap to meter as one of the potential outcomes for that. And so there are a set of energy innovations which we are aware of today, and some other ones which may emerge, which could lead to us having a surplus of energy. Now we have a deficit of energy for a whole
Right.
array of reasons, and not least uh, the carbon impact of technologies, including AI and data centers, which are growing fast, the growing shift to basically more cars everywhere in the world, including in a whole array of developing countries across Africa, which, whether they are fossil fuel or electric, this still requires the energy generation. So if we start to have energy too cheap to meter, or at least a lot cheaper than it is now, we can, for example, start to do outdoor air conditioning in many places to be able to mitigate some of these impacts, to be able to potentially provide irrigation, desalinate water, have irrigation water for a whole array of crops.
Mm.
But without those energy advances, we are extremely challenges, and that's, the energy can be used, applied, converted to, amongst other things, to generate water, to be able to cool us, to be able to transport uh, food, but it's so dependent on the degree of energy innovation which we have.
Yeah. So just looking at a Forbes article on this as you were talking, we've seen at present AI accounts for, in terms of global energy consumption, about 3% of global energy consumption. That's as much CO2 emissions as Brazil, right? And that's going to increase. Consumption needs are going to increase from 460 terawatt hours in 2022 to 1,000 terawatt hours in 2026, which means in the United States by 2026 that it's equivalent to 6% of all power across the country for artificial intelligence. And data centers' energy demands are expected to double between 2026 and 2030. So that's a pretty
Well,
big deal.
there is some straight line extrapolation there, and
Sure.
the AI models are broadly becoming far more efficient, far more energy efficient. I mean,
Yeah,
countervailing that, of course,
Hinton's
we're going
made
to be
that point
building richer and more
repeatedly, right?
complex models.
Yeah.
But I think that essentially the first pass of these AI models have been extraordinarily energy intensive. But one of the issues, because of costs, amongst other things, energy costs quite a lot. So there's a motive to be able to create more energy efficient models, or just generally more resource intensive models, resource efficient models, and seeing some pretty extraordinary advances in existing models. So we might not have the same degree of AI intensity. And I think those figures also refer probably not just to AI, but to essentially data, internet, which are, not just AI, but
Yeah.
all the existing, the pre-chat GPT
Just even
usage
storing
of
all
electricity
the
is
images you
still
take
there
on your
before.
phone. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I used to use that stat back in the day, like this probably 10 years ago now. I was doing a keynote, but the stat of the day was uh 90% of all photos in existence happened in like 1 year, right? Like it was that's the growth that we were having exponentially in terms of image storage back, like 10 years ago. So pretty
Yes.
crazy. One of the things that we've seen Australia experimenting with, particularly, and to his credit, Elon Musk stepped in Adelaide or South Australia, quite visibly making a bet with the South Australian politicians, and it paid off with the battery farm. And one of the criticisms of renewables, of course, is that sun doesn't work at night, so you need to store energy. And we obviously have issues with lithium and cobalt production in terms of their carbon footprint as well. But there are some emerging technologies on the battery side that look pretty interesting. One older technology, which is sort of come back recently. I don't know if you've seen the the recent announcement about Bill Gates' sponsorship of a sodium nuclear reactor in the States?
No,
So
I didn't see that.
this just came over a week or so ago. But one of the technologies they use is molten salt for energy
Yep.
storage. Right. So molten salt batteries or molten salt can store energy for months at a time. So it would appear to be, and if you're going to desalinate a lot of water, you get salt as a byproduct. So it would seem a logical solution. But we are seeing some incredible advances in battery technologies as well. China just announced a aviation capable battery, a very high density or low density, I guess. Battery tech that would be suitable for aviation usage. So we are seeing some advances happening in the battery side, but it's still, we're not really set up, and maybe we'll get Ramez Nam on the show again to talk about this, but we're really not set up for storing energy like
Yeah,
that.
well, that's
But
yeah, that's one of the most critical things of shifting to the new environment, particularly where it's electricity at source renewables.
yeah.
So there's 2 points. One is obviously the portable batteries, the ones which we have in our smartphones and our cars and so on. But there is also the static storage, which to supply energy grids. And as you say, there are a number of very interesting technologies developing, including the sodium melting, also. Actually physical ones, large flywheels and so on, still have their role.
Mm,
Hydrogen, switching to hydrogen and
yep.
pulling back, that's actually sort of a pretty efficient in both ways in conversion. That can be done at a fair bit of scale. And there are other ones which is simply variations on lifting and lowering things, such as water. So you pump water up and pull the electricity back on the way down. It's not 100% efficient by any means, but it does mean there's essentially indefinite potential energy which you can derive from these things. So these are infrastructure projects, of course, in building these large scale battery storage, but we will need them. So we need to be able to create that. And there are, as you say, a number of different alternatives, non-rare earth alternatives to lithium ion and similar type batteries as well. So similar frame to this uncertainty around the trajectory of electricity generation and cost of electricity generation is the trajectory for battery technologies. And if we look at some
Mm.
scenarios, we've got to be looking for the world, really. We've got to look at fundamental uncertainties is how fast do we move at costs of renewable energy generation, and how effectively can we deploy, local and larger scale, battery storage.
What concerns me about this is, you know, it appears like we have the technology to solve these problems, but not the political will, right? Because ultimately it comes back to the question, well, who's going to pay for that? And, where are we going to find the budget for that if you're a government, for example? And it's not like we have any choice because we have to we have to bolster the grids anyway. That's clear from the energy demands we're going to have from electric vehicles. And if you see what China's been doing with the electric vehicles right now, in
Mm.
terms of their growth as a EV manufacturer. And we know China is very, very good at pushing out product across the world. But that combined with artificial intelligence, combined with the need to shift to cleaner sources of energy, it seems like it's a no-brainer for governments to be investing in these sorts of technologies. But privatization of the energy grids makes that slower, in terms of experimentation and things like that. So I wonder, as a sort of broader topic before we go to a break, do you think that this level of infrastructure resilience and mitigation and, re-engineering, the geoengineering you talked about and so forth, requires a very different way of thinking about the role of government and, corporations in these things? Like, how do we incentivize enough traction on these innovations to stay ahead of the problem?
I mean, it is, 2 levels. One is at a national level, the other is at an international cooperative level. And I think the international is very hard for all sorts of reasons. So there's a number of initiatives where I think we could see this more, particularly potentially in East or Southeast Asia, or potentially in Africa. But a lot of this is the individual willingness of governments to step up and to do these things. The thing is, we have 300 trillion of financial capital available in the world, and some, let's say, probably around 5% of that's in sovereign wealth funds. There's a whole lot um, in other vehicles, but there is this weight of capital which is
Mm.
looking for worthwhile things to invest in. And part of it, if you're truly a long-term investor, you have a vested interest in social stability and economic stability
Yes.
and systems working and so on. So I think if we start to tap those investors which have long-term timeframes, which include, of course, insurers as well as sovereign wealth funds, and be able to get consortia for some of these very high cost projects where there will be financial returns on these projects, as well as broader positive impact on the array of other investments that these organizations will have.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Changing our investment horizon. Look, we used to have much longer term investment views. Think about the cathedrals built, through Europe in the, the Renaissance and things like that. I mean, some of these projects were 100-year plus projects that were overtaken. The Apollo project over a decade, the genome, the Human Genome Project, again, over a decade of work in that. So there are precedents for us doing sort of longer time horizon, but it seems like we need that sort of cultural shift to one of the payoff may not come in your lifetime, but it's the right thing to do for humanity. And that's we've become more short-term focused in terms of return on investments, in the last 60 years in particular, you know. So I think that's maybe a cultural shift that we need. As you say, the capital is there to deploy, and the technology is there as well. So it's sort of frustrating, isn't it, when you can see we could fix this. It's all we have to do is just, and people might say, well, we're not sure about which technology might work or whatever. But well, why aren't we experimenting with more to sort of find that? I guess that's the frustration level there. But
Well, I'm seeing some positive signs in terms of shifts of attitude, and as I mentioned, particularly from sovereign wealth funds, which are generally around the world pretty good at the long term time frame. And in fact, if you start to see uh, so the BlackRocks and the other very large institutional investors are all looking at essentially these factors being a fundamental issue in how they choose their investments.
yeah, absolutely. Well, let's have a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists with myself and Ross Dawson. We're talking about the future. We're going to have a quick break and be right back.
I'm Ross Dawson, having a wonderful conversation with Brett King on the Futurists. So, one of the key things shaping the future today is the very rapid progress of artificial intelligence. And I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that we are looking at a multi-agent uh, world. And that's the hottest topic right now in AI is multi-agents, where we have a number of different agents working together and collaborating. And this echoes what we've been looking at for decades or potentially even centuries, this idea of collective intelligence of humans. How do we bring lots of humans together to be collectively more intelligent than they are individually? Now I've got AI. And so the system saying, well, we've got human agents, AI agents, and the potential for the best of human intelligence and the best of artificial intelligence to be brought together in systems where we can potentially solve some of the biggest problems and to transcend where we have been in the past.
Yeah, this idea of sort of collaborative intelligence. I mean, we see it occurring even, like there's direct efforts at this with like Neuralink and so forth, sort of trying to combine human and AI intelligence. And, Musk has talked about having to augment our own intelligence to keep up with AI. But more than that, it's just we are already starting to see it, for example, in terms of the work that's been done on protein folds and various applications in the medical field, diagnostics, and so forth. These are great examples of collaborative intelligence. your self-driving car when it's ready. Okay, maybe it's not. Well, up until the point that we can learn, these cars can learn to use it. Learn to drive competently at that level. There's collaboration there. So, but solving some of these geoengineering problems we talked about in the first half, designing new types of energy grids, designing new types of medicines, food scarcity approaches. There would seem to be so many areas, not only where we can use AI collaboratively, but also advances we might get from quantum computing, particularly in the 2030s. And if we can somehow, put those together, then our technical capability to solve scientific problems and technical constraints could definitely take a level up in terms of that sort of collective intelligence. So that's, I mean, Kurzweil just was reported on, he's out pushing his Singularity is Near book at the moment. He was talking about 1,000-fold increase in intelligence because of AI, which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. We can't even really conceptualize of that sort of level of that. But I guess, where do you see AI right now? I mean, obviously you're talking about integrating AI into organizations and stuff. Where is the collaborative effort right now?
So, I mean, well, just picking up the point around the scientific discovery, and that's actually something I've been focusing on, is the roles of AI in science, and just sort of laying out the different phases of scientific discovery. And there's some really interesting research being done to, uh, amongst other things, to, for example, provide knowledge graphs to map out what we understand about particularly domains, to be able to compare that with other scientific areas, and to uncover new hypotheses and new possibilities for research. So there is I still see, for the as long as I can imagine, which is quite a long way, that we'll have the scientists, humans will still be leading these efforts, but there'll be so many ways in which we can be supported and being able to build that. But part
Yeah.
of this comes to the architectures of how it is we combine the, individual ingenuity or understanding with AI tools to be able to support that. So at the moment, there's, in organizations, a lot of what has been done is simply around the productivity layer. But I
Right.
am doing work with boards and executive teams, and I'm seeing some of the best of what's happening, which is still sort of very small at the moment, is to be able to take groups of people thinking about the most complex issues, to be able to give to AI what it can do best in terms of identifying emergent trends or analyses, or providing counterpoints, or testing against scenarios, or a whole array of different tasks which get to a better outcome, but one which is still human first, which
Mm.
we can see which I think will be in the lead for for as decades, I
So
think.
we become the conductor of the orchestra, but often that heavy lifting. But it does require us then to, um, you know, obviously this is why we need to deal with the whole data ownership issues and so forth. Because if you're going out into a particular field of research to get the data that can inform AI, that can model these changes, we're going to have to deal with that that issue. But yeah, there's massive potential there for these sort of collaborative approaches. We had Alex Zhoronikov, from Insilico. Um, I probably messed up his surname, but he, talking about the fact that they've got now multiple labs in 6 geographies, I think, churning out generative medicines, and so forth. So that was a really interesting. I didn't realize it was so advanced in respect to that we were so close to new medical compounds and so forth being created, and that's even before we start
Yes.
personalizing medicine. With sort of DNA matching and stuff like that. You mentioned the other night when we're having dinner that you've been looking at, um, your own DNA in terms of dietary patterns and things like that,
Yes.
optimizing diet. So you want to talk about that a bit more
Yeah, well, absolutely. So
briefly?
I was giving a keynote in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia on the future of food. And one of the things I mentioned in my keynote was nutrigenomics, this this application of genetics, individual genetics to our nutrition. And at the end of my keynote, someone came out in the audience and says, "Oh, I'm the CEO of nutrigenomics."
Oh,
A
really?
professor at University of Toronto who'd been basically studying genetics and doing and also researching, finding all of the other studies which correlated people's individual
So
genetic
cool.
profile with actionable things in terms of their food intake, as in things which they should have more of or less of, or things which can, in fact, help assist with chronic conditions or to be able to improve
Mm,
fitness. And so he offered, and now received, and I've got a booklet which runs through all of my genetics and how that impacts the food
that's
which
very
I
cool.
should be eating. And this points to, again, sort of this looks when we start to get lower and lower costs. So we're getting down to $100 or less for a full genome sequence. We don't need a full genome sequence anyway to do this kind of
No.
data. It's pretty low cost in identifying specific genetic markers or clusters of genetic markers, which give us insight into our, what is the best food for us as an individual, as opposed to just generally healthy food. And I think this is, looking at the food domain, this is something which is going to shape. A significant number of people will have more and more data, more and more insight into, potentially having personally created foods, but more just being able to design their own diet. And this is where AI can then assist us. And there's actually one of the interesting things, and just to bounce off you as well, you may have seen that there was an announcement this week from Ariana Huffington and Sam Altman, which were essentially they're building AI into Thrive Health, which is Ariana Huffington's venture, where they will provide personalized health coaching using AI, hyper personalized, they call it. So essentially, you know everything about a person, and we will give you the nudges
Yeah.
which are
Yeah.
relevant for you in terms of your health, and which we're going to the ones which are most likely to nudge your behaviors. So I think some interesting points there as the degree of personal data that's required for that type of hyper personalized advice or nudging or behavioral change. But I mean, it comes back to the fact if AI can assist us in positively shifting our behaviors, what we eat, how we exercise, when we sleep, whatever it may be,
How you
that's
use
an
your money.
enormously positive
Yeah.
impact.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I think if you're looking at the longevity thing, and I've been researching this, the last year or so in anger, looking at potentially building some companies around it, in terms of longevity plus AI. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of really clear is that one of the big elements of AI is the behavioral change that will be possible, at least individually. If you want to tackle longevity, if you want to live longer and have that health span, you are going to have to radically change your behavior. And it's the food you eat, it's the exercise you do, sleep. And we've seen Brian Johnson experimenting with this stuff recently, and he's popularized the concept that it is possible to reduce your biological aging. But this is just a technical constraint right now, and he's spending millions of dollars a year to get that data. But AI can, as you say, democratize that and make it affordable and accessible. So you talked about the sort of multi-agent platform, and let's muse on that for a little bit. I think what's really interesting is, if you do have an AI agent, I've often thought about that. I talked about it in Augmented, but your ability to personalize your own AI agent. We've saw it in Her with Samantha. We see that depiction of your personalized, even when you read Ian Banks's Culture series and so forth, having your own personal AI that understands you, understands your genome, understands all of those elements about your behavior, and is that personalized coach and assistant. Um, that to get to that sort of world, it's almost like we need this layer of integration of all these AI agents being able to talk to each other. And I guess that's the start of sort of the machine to machine economy emerging. But
Yes.
there are practical constraints, like how does a AI agent work across operating systems and stuff. But what are your thoughts on how that develops?
Well, I mean, there's, a universe of implications of this, but I think,
Yeah.
taking one of them is simply this idea of a digital twin, where essentially it's an AI representative of us who, in some cases, has been, recently mooted, can look like us and talk like us and be like us, and hopefully is authorized. And we give it scope to have conversations with people, potentially to even make decisions on our behalf. So on a smaller level, we can just have bots which go out and buy things for us, or to represent us in simple transactions. We can have now essentially avatars of us which look like us, and where we can go out to delegate. So this is one of the questions: why, to what degree will we delegate to our digital twins
Mm.
the ability to make decisions on our behalf, to speak with other people? There was obviously the conversation recently where the CEO of Bumble was saying, you will have our digital twins go out and
Yes, I saw that.
basically have a conversation with other people to work out whether they're worth going on
The
a
two
have a
AIs
real
talk
life
and then they
conversation
figure
with.
out there's a connection, then they pass it back to IRL. Yeah.
So in that case, the issue of the platforms doesn't come in, because essentially we have a representative. We just use normal communication channels to engage with them, using verbal or visual or audio, audio
Mm.
interactions. And this starts to raise some pretty serious questions now around how much we want to have digital twins, which could be more than one, could be many of, which represent us, which look like us except a little bit better, uh, or
Yeah, a
potentially
younger version of ourselves.
have
Yeah.
more information behind us. And this, there are economies, as you say, the machine to machine economy is what happens when they start to interact, and what are some of the unforeseen implications of what is essentially then a this this bot economy of people interacting with each other, and what happens in terms of pricing, in terms of economic value, in terms of whether our digital twins can do work that is paid for while we sit down and have a beer or whatever. So this is really central to the next phase of the economy and life.
Well, this comes back to the concept of personhood as well, right? We see a lot
Yes.
of debate of that in the States around unborn children and things. I don't want to get into that today, but the legal applications of personhood. If you've got your digital twin person going out, making deals, doing work, interacting with other AI agents, representing you, you'd want to be pretty sure that it's accurately representing your needs, desires, wants, and standards and so forth. And theoretically, based on generative AI, we have these AIs that can learn our behaviors. I use the example of that Japanese digital pop star Hatsune Miku, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that there were young men getting married to this virtual AI,
Yes.
a piece of software. Uh, and so now and you think, well, that sounds ridiculous. But now, if you have an AI that can perfectly craft itself to your behaviors and your intellect and so forth, um, your resistance to the technical elements of that and your tendency to trust an AI that seems to be so in tune with you would seem to be something that we would get comfortable with quite quickly.
I think so. I think, and this is something where there are some people who would be very cautious, or would want to supervise or have a lot of interaction with these things. But I think, given what we've seen in behaviors of people over the last while, I think that there's many people would very quickly say, "Yeah, that's good," and they just
Yep.
let it go away and not even check what it was doing
Go
until it got
forth and represent me, AI. Yeah.
fine, or got you put in prison, or whatever it may
Yeah.
be. So
Well, see, that's a question, right? What happens if our AI agent makes a disastrous decision? Are we held legally
well,
responsible
yes,
for
and
that?
that's which goes to this point where so I did a recent framework of levels of delegation to AI, and where basically different types of decision, different degrees of complexity, how much and in what way can we or should we be delegating those decisions to AI, and with what degree of human oversight. But all of this still means that whoever is delegating to AI still is accountable.
Mm,
And that's one thing which I think, if you're on a board, you probably understand that. If you are an individual who's suddenly given a tool, you may not realize
yeah.
or really comprehend fully that you are accountable for whatever your AI does. Or, I guess the producer of the manufacturer could also be liable. Well, there's lots of lawyers' fees to be earned on these issues, no doubt.
It just really, I mean, every time we sort of talk about this, I think we realize how far away from fit for purpose our legal infrastructure is to deal with this. There's so many, I mean, there are analogies that we could use for
Mm.
this. Having said that, I feel like so much is going to change in this area. Just even the concept of consciousness and what an emerging AI layer of intelligence will do to our understanding of consciousness. I mean, I think, I personally think that having to negotiate with AI, we call it collaborative intelligence, but there's going to be some negotiation. Like, for example, what if we program an AI to tell us about the tactics we should be using to limit, climate change? And the first thing the AI says is you've got to get rid of fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and here's the path to do that. um, then immediately you're going to have resistance of those industries, right? If you come up with radical new healthcare methodologies that goes around our existing sort of pharmaceutical industries, you're going to have resistance to that. So even with collaboration, where AI gives us these technical advantages, we still may have the human factor coming into play there.
Oh,
So it's
well,
not
naturally.
straightforward, right?
No, though, I mean, one of the things you can also ask AI is, well, what are strategies to be able to convince fossil fuels to do that, or what are ways to be able to
Right.
assist them to transition to different economic structure and so on. But, we want all change to be win-win, but unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way. So with the
Yeah.
change, there sometimes are people that either lose or prefer the way things were. And so that's just the reality of politics, of society, of the reality is we do need change. We can't stick to how we've done things forever because we are in a changing world. But we can find the best ways where the most people win the most, and
Mm.
people who do have some economic or other losses, that's minimized or that can be shifted into new economic structures. I mean, that's the positive potential for sure.
Do you think that we sort of require? I mean, sort of. I think about this. It's like every major corporation should have a futurist on their board now. I'm not just saying this to get my mates jobs on as non-executive directors, but why isn't it that more governments have forecasters in their teams? Yeah, we have, research and so forth. Like the US military is always doing research on these next generation technologies and so forth. But from an infrastructure perspective, you'd think right now you'd need to have a futurist, in the cabinet. um, you'd need to have someone in AI specialization looking at large scale systems design to improve the efficiency of government and things like that. I'm surprised we aren't already, like, putting more future proofing capabilities in, and also just not future proofing but the transitional element, right? Is how do we like in those areas we've talked about where there's going to be resistance, how do we help people be aware of the fact that this transition is going to be needed and that change is a constant? Because you see it from, you mentioned the politics, what's happening in Europe, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, with Trump in the US, the populist movement. There's plenty of people that are rearward looking that would like things to go back to the way they were, but that's, in the technology environment we're in, that's not going, we're not going to stay the same. It's not going to be static. It's going to change. It's going to, if anything, going to change faster, right?
Yeah, well, I always say everyone needs to be their own futurist, and I think that includes board directors and politicians or leaders of government. I mean, there are political constraints around the how long their term of thinking is, but this there are more governments that are establishing futures bodies within within their governments, and there's still relatively limited resources, and they may not have a strong enough voice, but there are positive trends. I don't think any I'm not aware of many countries that are going backwards on that. Essentially, there's more foresight built into things, and this needs to be essentially not just say, okay, here's a futurist to be part of the conversations, but everybody has the training and the outlook and the frame of mind which can take us to understanding the implications of change, systems change, and potential paths forward, and what it is that today that can push us towards positive futures. So this has to be embedded in all institutions at all levels, and that's part of the journey that you and I are on to
Yeah.
help bring about those shifts.
So this is interesting. I just did a search, and the first thing that came up in Google was World Economic Forum. It was an interview with Mohammed Al Ghawawi, the Minister of Cabinet Affairs in the UAE. And he says governments must be continuously planning for a 20 to 50-year time horizon to address the complex problems of today. And he said every government needs to have a futurist in the cabinet. So it's not just us saying this.
Yeah, well,
It's
the UAE is particularly foresight. So I do quite a few. I do lots of time frames on my keynotes. One of them, some of them are 25 years, and the longest one is 50 years, which I did in fact
mm,
for the United Arab Emirates Prime Minister's office. So they were looking for a 50-year time frame, and that's what is essential, really, to be able
yeah.
to make decisions today, which will shape the positive futures.
All right, so we got to find a way to wrap this up because we've only got a couple of minutes left. But we've covered a lot of ground today, which is great. It was exactly how we planned it, just to have a chat, two futurists having a talk. The audience seems to love this stuff. But what are you most optimistic about moving forward?
The Well, the positive potential of AI. I mean, I am focusing very squarely on AI at the moment, and the potential for us at the highest level to make better decisions. So using, it's not just around saying, okay, AI, what should we do, but how do we bring in AI into making better decisions? And one of the most important single decisions is the allocation of capital, as I talked about before. And if we can make just that incremental tiny little shift in getting better economic and social outcomes from the way we deploy capital, that will be absolutely massive. And I think see a whole lot of tools and structures and shifts in thinking and architectures, which I think can help us to improve our decision making, our allocation of capital, and as such, helping to shape a better future in some pretty interesting times today.
Mm. I mean, one way to do that might be, say, to billionaires, all right, we're going to tax you at 90% unless you can find something for the public good to do with your capital. Something like that maybe could work. Yeah, it's going to be called socialism by many, but I guess my hope is that philosophically, what you're saying is that the commitment to deploy financial resources on these things to help us adapt to change becomes something that philosophically is we're not asking the question about the payoff and the return on investment, because it's just the right thing to do to deploy those resources in improving our chances in the future. But we're
Yeah,
not
which
there
I think
yet.
is fully aligned. I rarely see any gap between the economic benefit and the broader,
Mm,
as you say, call it broadly the right thing to do. Almost always this brings about if you frame it in the right time frames, how it's done, the ability to impact societies positively, even environments, everything else you could think of, all of these broader things are aligned with positive economic benefit, which goes back to what I was saying in the largest institutional investors in the world, all being focused on environment, society, governments,
Yeah.
and the
Instead
things
of
which
just
have an
building
impact.
bunkers in New Zealand or Hawaii, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's not an outcome I don't think anybody wants. I mean, who wants?
No.
Yeah, that's not where we want to get to. And I think those with the most money realize that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ross, it's great to have a chat with you. I appreciate you making some time available for us today. Um, I know you are still working on the Thriving on Overload theme from your latest book. So if you want to check that out, thrivingonoverload.com is the book that deals with a world of exponential information and leading in that environment. But Ross, how else can people follow what you're doing as a futurist and some of your more recent research?
Well, my general work is at rossdawson.com. And in fact, most of my ventures now are under amplifyingcognition.com. So that's
Okay.
where I have my podcast and my newsletter and access to some of my AI courses and so on. But where I share the most online is on LinkedIn. It's always a good place to follow what I do.
Yeah, same. Well, thanks for joining me, and thank you to you guys for listening to the Futurists once again. If you like these chats between two futurists, Robert and I've been doing it for a while, but we're trying to do things that are more free form and open, because this is what when Ross and I get together for a coffee or for dinner, this is how we talk, right? So recording this stuff is very cool. But Ross, thanks again for joining us.
Awesome to be here. Thanks, Brett.
All right, that's it for the Futurist this week. We will be back with you next week. A couple of some really interesting interviews coming in the can over the next few weeks. So stay tuned. But until then, we'll see you in the future.